Okay, let's talk about composition when it comes to landscape photography. This is something that I struggled with when I first started doing landscape photography. It's something that a lot of people can struggle with, the idea that a great view doesn't automatically make for a great photo. We're going to talk about how I approach it, some tips and tricks I've picked up along the way. And as always, feel free to add your own ones down in the comments as well. Anything that we don't touch on. Let's get into it. It's Tutorial Tuesday. Welcome back to Tutorial Tuesday, where each and every Tuesday we bring you a brand new, fresh, yes indeed, a fresh, tasty photography tutorial. This week, like I said in the intro, we're talking about landscape photography and specifically how to approach the composition side of shooting your landscape photos. Landscape photography is super exciting. I love it. It's one of my favorite genres of photography to go and shoot. It always has been. I love going somewhere new, trying to capture a new photograph, and I love going back to old favorite spots to try and take a new and interesting shot of that same location. But the composition side of it can just be a little bit challenging, a little bit extra challenging. And there's a few steps I take to really think through the composition, either in a new place or an old favorite. So let's dive into it. Now, we're not going to be touching on the specific tools like rule of thirds, symmetry, leading lines. Those are all fantastic compositional tools that I absolutely do use. But you need to kind of work out what's important and what the framing is going to be like before you can even start thinking about that kind of thing. So the first thing I'll do when I get to either to a new location or an old favorite is I'll just take a minute, right? Relax, just stop for a second, take it all in yourself before you're even thinking about the camera. Now, I think this is really important just because I think it's a healthy thing to do, right? Take in that landscape for yourself before you're even thinking about the actual photo. Breathe it in and actually feel the landscape in front of you. That's going to make for a better end result as well, because you're going to get to know that landscape a little bit better. I'll take 5-10 minutes just without my camera even out of the bag, just looking over the whole scene. And what I'll start asking myself is, what's important in the landscape, right? You might have a beautiful view, really wide vista, but what's important here? What are the important elements of the landscape? And once you start breaking that down, and it could be anything, right? It could be a specific spot in the landscape. It could be the sun setting. It could be the beautiful colors, the beautiful light. There's lots of different elements that could be important to your scene. But once you start identifying those, you need to work out, okay, well, what is the actual subject of this photo? Where is the anchor point within this frame? Now, this is important for a lot of different reasons, right? Number one, we're going to start to build our composition around that subject. The subject is going to work as the anchor point for the viewer of your photo, right? So it's really important. It's the natural resting place for the eye of whoever's looking at your photo. So it's a really important integral part of this landscape photo. And once you've worked out what the subject of your photo is, you can start to think back to, okay, well, what else is important? What are the supporting parts around that subject? That's going to tell you a lot about the framing, how zoomed in you might want to be. Now, if you're using a zoom lens, of course, you've got a lot of control there for how much you want to include in the frame. If you're using a prime lens, you're going to be moving yourself. But how zoomed in, how close to your subject do you want to get? It also tells you a lot about the kind of angle you might want to go for. So, for example, if the sky is particularly beautiful, you might want to be going for a lower angle to your shot. That's going to help you work out your composition, right? Almost a hero shot, maybe of a lighthouse looking upwards. For example, this shot is slightly lower to the ground, facing a little bit upwards towards the lighthouse because the sky was very beautiful. But I also wanted to include part of the landscape which was much closer to me because it nicely frames the lighthouse. That's very similar to this shot, which is much later in the day, very different time of year, which felt a little bit spooky. So I wanted to include some of the silhouetted tree, right? Very dark, around the same lighthouse. Very different feel to the photo, very different spot. So, okay, we've identified the subject, the important parts of the photo, right? The supporting parts to your subject. And those kind of work almost like parts of a puzzle that we're now basically putting together for our composition. And that's where your tools come in with the rule of thirds, right? The leading lines, the symmetry. This photo is much more simple. It's just about the light. It's about the colors in the sky. We've got the orange off to one side and a much deeper blue off to the other side, and the horizon line. That's pretty much it. So symmetry makes a lot of sense with this photo. This one, there's lots of different parts which felt important to me, right? The cliffs, the sunset, and the gradient in the sky, which looked unbelievably mesmerizing. But I wanted to include these rocks and kind of a long exposure to give some context for exactly where we were and layer up the photo a little bit. But that's me working out, okay, what is important in the frame. Sometimes it might be that there's a person in the landscape that works as your subject, and then you need to decide how much of the environment do you want to have around that person. This photo, for example, feels much more like an adventure, almost like a portrait, but very wide and a nice adventure-y shot. And that's because Matilda is very small in the frame, but everything around her gives a lot of context for where she is. Something else which is really important to consider is that shot was taken at Durdledore in Dorset. Now, I went there at sunset fully expecting to take a photo of the rock arch, right? That's what you go to Durdledore to photograph. But none of my photos of that came out particularly well. I wasn't particularly satisfied, and actually, I didn't like them that much. Instead, I loved that photo. I loved this photo, which I was much happier with because I incorporated bits that I felt were much more important than the actual stone arch itself. And do you know what? I don't have a picture of the stone arch that I particularly like that much. So it's important to also not be so focused on the specific photo you think you're going to be taking in your head, and actually react to what's in front of you. That's why I think you should take that time and actually look at the landscape yourself. Feel it out and work out what's important, what's happening here, and what is the story of the photo that you might want to take. And like I say, once you've worked all that out, you can use those other compositional tools to place your subject in the frame and start building around it. Rule of thirds is a nice, easy one to use because it can tell you where to put your horizon, where to put the subject, and leading lines are always good to look out for because they can lead your viewer's eye to your subject, which I think is great. This photo, for example, is essentially of the lighthouse again, but I wanted to keep it nice and wide because the winding road kind of leads you towards the lighthouse. So that's much more important, I think, to keep in the frame. Whereas this photo is from a lower angle, again, same lighthouse, but this time it's much more about the night sky and having those stars in the shot, which I'm really happy with. There's loads of different ways to compose the photo, but that thinking and slowing yourself down like that will help you to create a better end photograph. Now, those are my tips. Those are my feelings on how to start thinking about the composition when it comes to doing landscape photography. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have any other tips for how you approach it when you're out and about, pop them down in the comments. We can all learn from each other. I think that's a great part of this community that we have here. You guys are fantastic. You've got some fantastic ideas as well. So I'd love to hear that down in the comments. Of course, you can see a full list of all the kit we use for this video and all the photos and stuff like that down in the description of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well because there's new content all the time. I'll see you in the next video. But until then, as always, thanks for watching.